Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Ernesto Savona, and I'm pleased in introducing this webinar that comes as the first result of a project flows that Alberto Aziani, who is the first speaker, will introduce shortly. This project has been funded by PMI Impact, and I'm really thankful because funding was an extraordinary enterprise allowing us to do a research. The title of this workshop expresses or says the two things we are dealing with. First, the first results, provisional results of research flows are speaking about convergence of crime and displacement. In few words, going on human smuggling, you discover there is a lot of things going together in terms of crimes, not only connected, but criminal activities connected with those people, organizations dealing with human smuggling. This is really a very important argument because if we go on the other side, the second part of the title, Diverging Crimes, means once we are going to consider the European actions against human smuggling or facilitating illegal trade, we need to consider how much crime is connected. But I think it's very important to discuss all together, and I think we will have 1 hour 30 the duration of this webinar, what are the main policy implications of these things. Let me introduce the speakers and their order. The first person is Alberto Aziani, who is a senior researcher at Transcrime Università Cattolica del Sacro in Milan. The second speaker will be Luigi Achilli, a Marie Curie Fellow, European University Institute in Florence. The third speaker, Maisa Ayub, she is Associate Director of the Center for Migration and Refugee, American University in Cairo, and Fabrizio Sarica, Research Head or Research Expert in the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime in Vienna. And once we go to the policy, Laura Ferrari, MP of the European Parliament, Libre Committee, and Giovanni Cioffi, Policy Officer, European Commission, Migration and Home Affairs. We have 10 minutes, not more, and I think it will be a lively debate. Alberto, please, the floor is yours. Alberto?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Professor Savona, for your introduction, and thanks to all the participants for being here today. In the next minutes, I will be presenting some of the results of Project Flow concerning the convergence between migrant smuggling and other transnational crimes. The final results of the entire project will be disseminated in the course of 2020-2021. Very often in the public debate, it is stressed the risk posed by organized crime groups who are active in the smuggling of migrants, but at the same time are involved also in the trafficking of drugs or other illicit goods. Yet, when we look at the evidences behind this kind of assertion, what it comes out is that often they are anecdotal, and the empirical research behind this kind of topic, on this kind of topics, is actually scant. This is mainly due to difficulties in collecting reliable information and data on migrant smuggling in general and other forms of transnational crimes. Moving from these premises within Project Flows, we have been investigating if, how, and to what extent migrant smuggling actually converge with other transnational crimes. And we are doing it by focusing on the very relevant area of North Africa and the Mediterranean Sea, and considering the last decade. So the time span from 2011 to 2019. When we talk about convergence, we refer to 6 different forms of merging between migrant smuggling and other transnational crimes. To provide you with an example, we might think to a criminal group that smuggle migrants and at the same time get involved in the transnational traffic of drugs. In this case, we will have a functional or offense type of convergence. If the group exploit the same activities, the same tactics to bring on both the traffics, so migrant and drugs, in this case, we will have a form of tactical convergence. If they do it in the same moment in time, this same period of the year, in this case, we will have a form of temporal convergence. This is just an example focusing on few forms of convergence and on drugs. Within the research project, we focused on 6 forms of convergence and on 7 transnational crimes: drug trafficking, the trafficking of firearms, trafficking of tobacco products, and other ones. As I was briefly mentioning before, source of information and data on human smuggling and more in general on drug trafficking are actually hard to reach and quite scant. To overcome this difficulty and this limitation in the availability of data, we decided to rely on online news and press releases as source of information on specific cases of migrant smuggling. As first, we interrogated the LexisNexis database, which is a vast repository of news, to the use of ad hoc keywords in Arabic, English, and French to identify text dealing with migrant smuggling. Then, in a second moment, using analysis and text mining techniques, we isolated all those sources that were not solely discussing of migrant smuggling, but that were actually providing information on specific cases of smuggling. In other words, sources that were focusing on facts rather than on commenting them. Finally, within this population of relevant news, the remaining article, we analyzed forms of convergence with a human-based in-deep content analysis, and we counted the crime convergence cases with automatic text mining techniques. And what it comes out as first is that the most common forms of convergence between migrant smuggling and other transnational crimes are tactical convergence, spatial convergence, and functional or offense convergence. To provide you with some example, we may refer to the use of jet skis to move both migrants and cannabis from Morocco to Spain, or the use of trafficking tunnel along the Egyptian and Strip of Gaza border that were built to move both migrants, drugs, and other illicit goods. When we think at spatial convergence, a good example is provided by the route from Tunisia to Sicily that have been used to both move cigarettes, illicit cigarettes, and migrants, or we can think at the Sinai Desert, where it has been observed both drug trafficking and the trafficking of migrants. Finally, when we look at functional convergence, we can think to Libyan smuggling networks that have been active in the smuggling of migrants, but also in human trafficking and drug trafficking, or to some Amazigh groups that along the Trans-Saharan routes move both migrants and drugs. In this respect, these examples and this qualitative analysis provide evidences of convergence between migrant smuggling and other transnational crimes, and in a certain way support the public debate that underline and stress this kind of dynamic. Yet, when we move to the quantitative part of the analysis, what immediately comes out is that convergence between human smuggling and other forms of transnational crimes is actually quite rare. Focusing on the period 2011-2019, only in 3.4% of the cases that we considered, we actually identified any forms of convergence between migrant smuggling and other forms of crime. And moving on the right part of the slides, we can also see that the convergence actually differ a lot depending on the illicit good and the trafficking activities we are focusing on. So for example, convergence between migrant smuggling and drug trafficking is a little bit more frequent, 1.7% of the considered cases, while we have goods like medicine or cultural artifacts for which we were not able to find any forms of conversion in about 5,000 out of 5,000 of cases. To conclude, this research comes obviously with its own limitation, and further research and further analysis are needed to disentangle all the causes, consequences, and dynamics of the convergence between migrant smuggling and other forms of transnational crimes. Nonetheless, from these results, it's possible already to extract some preliminary policy implications. And I'm mentioning here two of them. As first, the convergence between migrant smuggling and other transnational crimes appear to be episodic. As such, it's hard to justify stricter controls on migratory flows in the name of the fight against the trafficking of illicit goods. On the contrary, the opening of opportunities for legal migration will reduce criminal opportunities, both directly and more obviously in terms of reduction in migrant smuggling and human trafficking, but also indirectly in terms of related criminal activities, corruption, money laundering, and document forgery. I thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to hear all other speakers and to debate with the audience at the end of the presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Alberto, once again. The floor is to Luigi Achilli. Luigi, as said, is Marie Curie Fellow, European University Institute, a good friend of us. He is doing research, empirical research in the area of migration. Luigi, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ernesto. Thanks, Alberto, for the presentation, which is perfectly in line with my findings that, not surprising, a part of your volume. Anyway, so thanks also for Transcrime for putting all this together. And without further ado, because time is limited, let me go into the core of my presentation, my brief presentation today. Basically, as you all know, in the current fight to human smuggling, a security approach has guided the policies implemented by the European Union. Now, the underlying logic is that smugglers operate under a cost-benefit calculation. So, according to which human smuggling can be eliminated by tackling its business model. So, to put it simply, the disposal of smuggling vessels, the empowerment of local coast guards in transit countries, and any other action aimed at disrupting the supply and demand of services will ultimately lead to the eradication of the phenomenon. Well, has this worked out? Well, it's hard to say. According to some, yes. Others are more skeptical. I'm actually include myself into the rank of the skeptical ones. So, scholarly work on international migration has identified the failure of Europe's fight against human smuggling to reach its intended goals of protecting migrants and curbing crime. Now, the goal of this brief talk today is to shed more light on the current situation in North Africa and the Mediterranean Sea. In particular, I want to do that by shedding more light on the impact of the anti-smuggling policies on the evolution of human smuggling in the Mediterranean. And to do so, I will compare the Eastern Mediterranean route with the Central Mediterranean route. Now, a comparison of these two major routes gives three important findings. First of all, the implementation of security-based migration policies across both routes shows that there is not a direct correlation between migration flows and smuggling networks. So, in other words, if we look at the data collected across the Eastern Mediterranean routes prior the EU-Turkey agreement, which I suppose there is no need to explain here for this. Data collected prior the agreement show that there are the areas traveled by large numbers of migrants, especially across the Western Balkan routes, have not necessarily witnessed the proliferation of smuggling networks. It also demonstrates that the tightening of border control after the EU-Turkey agreement and more proactive law enforcement action have stemmed the flow of people, but led, paradoxically, to an increase in smuggling activities across the Western Balkan route. On the other hand, in the Central Mediterranean route, we have a different scenario. Now, the externalization of border control and more restrictive migration policies have actually considerably stemmed the flow of people, well, considerably, in part, partly stemmed the flow of migrants And also, we have also witnessed a decrease in the smuggling activities. However, it's hard to say whether this has led to a disruption of the smugglers' business model. It's more the case, as Alberto was mentioning, rather a case of functional displacement. In other words, many of the people that were, many of the key actors and the key smugglers that were active in the Central Mediterranean route decided to jump on the other side of the barricade. They become anti-smugglers actors because it was much more convenient for them using the money, the conspicuous monies and financial and material resources channeled by the European Union in their countries, Libya, Sahel in general. I mean, in order to capitalize on this rather than keep smuggling people. However, this has not led to the end of the suffering of migrants, as is reported by several humanitarian reports by a plethora of organizations. And in many cases, it has not led to the end of the criminal business model, because many of these smugglers have eventually switched to the smuggling of other goods like drugs, gold, fuel, so on and so forth. Secondly, a comparison of the two routes shows the same patterns of tactical displacement among smuggling networks. Well, this means basically that smugglers do stealing activity across both routes have changed their modus operandi through the employment of a variety of strategies aimed to limit the chances of apprehension, such as using disposable embarkation, leaving migrants on their own during the crossing, and so on and so forth. Now, we may ponder about this capacity of smugglers to quickly adapt to the fast-changing scenario of border control. One of the reasons may have to do with the organization, the structures of smuggling networks. As a matter of fact, smuggling networks across the Mediterranean consist of a system of small, loose groups that enter into partnership with one another, but for short period of time. Now, even in the case of large groups, we are not talking of highly hierarchical and structured organizations. Often the relationship between the lowest member of the ranks and the top, the boss, it's just one person in the middle, even in the case of the largest organization. However, a wide range of opportunistic freelancers support these groups by offering temporarily their services. Now, these freelancers are local communities. Also, this is one of the reasons why smuggling is so much difficult to eradicate, because it's very much ingrained into local society, embedded in local economies. So a large numbers of those who provide services within the smuggling groups, they are not actually smugglers full-time. They're like taxi drivers, maybe hotel operators, people subleasing their lands, so on and so forth. Finally, a comparison between the two routes shows that the increase in law enforcement activities leads to a case of market convergence. Now, connections between human smuggling and human trafficking are increasingly self-evident. I agree with Alberto completely that I think they are overestimated. Still, there are evidence of this connection, ranging from sex trafficking to the use of forced labor in agricultural fields and gold mines. Yet it would be naive, I think, to assume that the interaction of smuggling with other illicit trades is a case of top-down market. In other words, where highly sophisticated criminal organizations adopt a monopolistic behavior, an aggressive agenda of market incorporation in order to take over the control of other criminal organizations and activities. It's not like the case of a Spectre, 007 Spectre organization that decides to take over smuggling, run it along human trafficking and drug trafficking and so on and so forth. Even though there may be cases of large organizations incorporating the business, in most, ethnographic and secondary sources show that market interaction constitutes an example of the expansion of precarity amid limited capacity for mobility, often emerging from the scale-up of law enforcement activities. So what I mean with this, to put it simply, the intensification of law enforcement efforts has led migrants to voluntarily, to not say willingly, because there is, of course, they are not willing, to enter situations characterized by exploitation in order to enhance mobility or simply their own livelihoods of survival. For example, my research in the Bekaa Valley region area in Lebanon adjoining Syria shows that many of the unaccompanied minors that are working in conditions of forced labor in the agricultural fields of the Bekaa Valley, basically they do that voluntarily because it's the only way to cope. Many of these people, all of these people were formerly smuggled. Some of them was smuggled already with the idea of working into going into forced labor because this was the only way for them to find work. And other works, like for example, other researchers show, for example, how women from Nigeria that go into that eventually are forcibly, well, they end up into situation of sex trafficking. They do it willingly because this is the only way, the safer way to cross the Mediterranean. Way safer going with the traffickers than actually going with smugglers. So to conclude, because time is almost over, so EU migration policies have had certainly a deep impact on human smuggling in the Mediterranean. Yet it would be a leap of faith assessing the outcome of these interventions as always effective in eradicating human smuggling. Even less plausible is the assumption that they have reduced migrants' plight and suffering, as is clear, with increased suffering and increased violation of human rights, the abuses perpetrated against migrants and people on the move. So understanding human smuggling in the Mediterranean and presumably elsewhere requires moving beyond overly deterministic approaches and look at the phenomenon of human smuggling in its complexity. So any fair assessment of the impact of current smuggling policies and the evolution of human smuggling these days, may thus prove difficult, if not impossible, without a better ethnographic engagement with the local dynamics that give place to human smuggling. And I'm over. Thank you, I'm done. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Luigi. For these, we will discuss these things in the conclusions. The floor is to Maiza Ayub, Associate Director of the Center for Migration and Refugee, American University in Cairo. I remember she is the person who can say a lot of different things about migrant smuggling from Africa to across the Mediterranean to Europe because it's Egypt. And I remember also that in one of the meetings of the Project Flows, Maiza is one of the partners, there was coming that Egypt was the first country ratifying the protocol on human smuggling of the European Commission. And we have been trying with Gianluca, a researcher at Transcrime, to measure the impact of this law. It was on displacement effect, if they are moving to another side. It was extremely interesting to see, and probably this was also applied for other countries, but at least as I understood, Egypt was the first country in Africa on the Mediterranean ratifying the UN protocol on human smuggling. Maiza, please, you have the floor.
Thank you.
Oh.
Actually today I'm going to talk more about the reasons behind the increased irregular migration, and I'm not focusing on smuggling and trafficking, but rather the reason of people. So I will share the presentation. Sorry, just a second. Okay. So as I said, I'm looking at the reason behind the movement, and I think it's important to understand why irregular migration is increasing is to look at the internal factors that are related to the MENA region itself, as well as reasons related to Europe. So very briefly, just to talk about the routes which was mentioned already, that migrants used and the nationality. They use these four main routes. The Central Mediterranean, which extends from Tunisia and Libya to Italy, is mostly used by those originating from these two countries or residing or passing through it, who are mostly from Eastern Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Egyptians and Syrians. The Western Mediterranean extends from Morocco and Algeria to Spain, so it's mostly used by Moroccan and Algeria. Eastern Mediterranean, Western Balkan from Turkey to Greece and to Bulgaria, so mostly used by Syrians and Afghani. So as it's well known and documented, the profile and motives of irregular migrants coming from the region is mixed. It includes those fleeing conflict in the Sub-Saharan Africa and aiming to seek asylum in Europe. But the majority are actually coming from countries of first asylum. They are either registered as asylum seeker in these countries or already got the refugee status. So they are fleeing countries like Sudan, Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco. And then we have a group of economic migrants. So basically, to understand the reasons, we have to look at the two groups. So there are the group of asylum seekers and refugees, and then the group of the economic migrants. So countries like, people fleeing conflicts, usually they flee first to the country, to neighboring countries. And in their mind, these are transit country because they believe that the conditions of their flight will get better and they can go back to their countries of origin. But as we all know, the most of the conflict in the region are protracted in nature, including those of Africa as well as Syria. So they end up after a while realizing that these countries are no longer transit, but they are potential countries of destination. In a country like Sudan, for example, it's impossible to continue hosting people fleeing other areas in Africa. So these are potential irregular migrants for sure, for those living in Sudan. In Jordan and Lebanon, both are not signatory to the 1951 Geneva Convention, and although they were very hospitable and receiving a large number of Syrian refugees, definitely the situation is overwhelming, and these Syrians potentially would think about moving further to Europe. Now, with countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco, they are countries that signed the 1951 Geneva Convention, but the three countries have no local asylum legislation. If we take Egypt, for example, the only legal instrument that is governing refugee status conditions in Egypt is a memorandum of understanding signed with UNHCR in 1954, and which specifically put forward repatriation and resettlement as the only two durable solution to end the refugee problem. So local integration is not an option in Egypt. Local integration in the legal sense of the term, in terms of long-term settlement and potentially citizenship. And it's the same as in Tunisia and Morocco. Adding to that is the fact that access to service is very much restricted. Of course, it depends and it differs from one group to the other because, for example, Syrians and Sudanese in Egypt do have more access than other group of asylum seeker and refugees because of bilateral agreement between Egypt and these countries. However, still the access is restricted because the country is a developing country, and also because of the situation of the economy, the high level of unemployment, which forced the migrant in Egypt to, and also in Tunisia and other countries in the region, to be confined to the informal sector. So being confined to the sector with no access to services definitely would make them potential irregular migrants. Now, if we look at the economic migrants, and we take Egypt as an example, now Egypt since the 1970s is known as a sending country, and however, the majority of those of the Egyptian migrants were migrating to countries within the region. So particularly those who are semi-skilled and low-skilled, and those are the ones who are potential irregular migrant. These were absorbed by countries like the Gulf countries, Libya, and Jordan. Now, with regard to the Gulf countries, the demand on Egyptian migrants has dramatically decreased since the 90s because of what they call the Gulfanization, which is the preferring locals over migrants, and because of the competition from Asian migrants. With regard to Libya, not only the crisis of 2011 had reduced the migration of Egyptians to Libya, but actually it led to the return of more than 2 million migrants from Libya to Egypt. With regard to Jordan, the influx of the Syrian refugees to Jordan has affected to some extent the demand on Egyptian labor because Syrians are available for work. So all these conditions had meant that many Egyptian semi-skilled and low-skilled that were migrating within the region are potential irregular migrants. Sub-Saharan African also have been in Libya for quite some time as economic migrants. When Libya, because of the oil and gas wealth in Libya, but the sanction on Libya, the fall in the prices of the oil had made these opportunities difficult. Many of them were deported during the late 1990s and the early 2000s back to Sub-Saharan African. However, many remain in the country and they are in irregular condition and as such potential irregular migrants. Sub-Saharan African are allowed to enter Tunisia without a visa. However, many of them go to Tunisia hoping to find employment, but they end up in the informal sector, which again put them or make them think about moving further. So the main reasons in the region that push people to think about irregular migration is the protracted nature of most conflict in the region and the inability of the international community to find a solution to the root causes of the political problem, the lack of prospects for local integration in countries of first asylum, the high level of unemployment, and the reduction in employment opportunities within the region, migration opportunity within the region. And then in addition to that, there are also expectations about living in northern countries. And these expectations, it's always believing that they will find work in Europe, their life in Europe will be much better. And usually it is expectations that are provided by other migrants. Even those who travel irregularly, once they go there, and even if their living condition is not as good, they still provide this perception. The reason in Europe, as it has been mentioned and it's well documented, that the lack of formal regular channel for migration is what increasing the irregular kind of movement. So if there is a desire to really decrease irregular migration, then formal opportunities should be provided. This is difficult given the rise of right-wing popular movement in Europe. So it's not a reason why irregular migration increasing, but it is a reason I would think making it difficult to promote a regular form of migration because there is anti-sentiment towards migration in general, whether even regular one. The reduction in resettlement opportunities is one of the reasons why irregular migration is increasing. And the reduction in resettlement opportunities is not only because of Europe, but mainly the United States. It is the major resettlement country, and it has drastically reduced resettlement options. And then finally, the structure of the labor migrant. The irregular migrants who make it to Europe, they do find opportunity. They do find work opportunities because the kind of work they are engaged in are not preferred by the locals. And sometimes the irregular migrants are even preferred by some businesses because of the fact that they accept low pay, they accept difficult living conditions. So as long as these opportunities do exist in Europe, there will always be demand, there will always be a desire to move. I think that's it, and I would be interested to receive questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maïsa, for these. Thanks also for being partner to our projects. We count on your help and cooperation on this project, also due to the difficult times we are going through. You, Maïsa, have saved us because it looks everybody's Italian by cause, but we have the 60% of foreigners registered and contacting. So you are the only non-Italian, also who speak English here, there, but is bi-casual. The next person who works at international level is Fabrizio Sarica, also an Italian. But Fabrizio is entitled, he is the head, the team leader of the human smuggling division and research division at the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime in Vienna. And he's a very good friend of mine. He has done PhD in Milan with us, and also is doing quite a relevant research in the area that I will be very happy if Fabrizio speaks about. Fabrizio, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Ernesto, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for those attending this webinar for the interest. I will focus on trafficking in persons. Of course, trafficking in persons and migrant smuggling, have been said before, are two different crimes. And it's important that we clarify this. Not all victims of trafficking are migrants, not to say smuggled migrants, and not all smuggled migrants end up in a situation of trafficking. Also because the numbers of migrants who are smuggled are very likely much relevant in terms of numbers. So there are much more migrants who have been smuggled than victims of trafficking. But of course, there is an overlap, especially when we focus on the routes we are focusing on today. And of course, the colleague panelists of this webinar have introduced this aspect. So where is the overlap? First of all, many migrants who are smuggled do not have the financial capacity to be smuggled. For this purpose, they end up into a debt situation. So they get into a deception contract deal with the smugglers or trafficker. They are sold the idea that they could travel, they can be smuggled to Europe by paying a certain amount for a certain cost, smuggling fees that they actually will pay back once they are in Europe. Once they get in Europe, this debt, these costs, these smuggling fees are much higher. So of course, the smuggling fees or this debt is inflated. They end up into an exploitative situations because, of course, they are supposed to pay back this debt by exploitation in the sex industry or into ending up in forced labor. But of course, the inflating the debt put them in a sort of exploitative situation that is trafficking in persons. So this is the first area where trafficking in persons, or let's say migrants who are smuggled, then end up into a trafficking situation. The second aspect, I would say, that is that smuggled migrants, for the fact that they are irregular migrants once at destinations, they are particularly vulnerable to be exploited, in the sense that being irregular, they are not willing to report exploitative practices by their employer. And if we want to call these people employers, or they are, let's say, abused in the sense that they are told these are the conditions, and if you complain, I will report you to the police. Beside some of them, let's say, having abuse in their vulnerability because they are they cannot find alternative being irregular migrants. And of course, there is also the issue of the unaccompanied minors, which is a big and important population, particularly vulnerable because they are minors and of course in a situation of debt, or their family in a situation of debt, as mentioned before, and particularly vulnerable and in economic need, so particularly vulnerable to be exploited once a destination in Europe. So all these elements goes exactly in that direction that was already mentioned by the panelists before me and by Alberto as a result of your research, that broadening the scope for regular migration will reduce the opportunities of these people to end up in the hands of the traffickers, because of course will reduce the costs, so to say, to migrate, so will reduce the possibilities of ending up into a debt situation with the smugglers, and will reduce the stigma, will reduce the fear of being repatriated if detected by national authorities at destinations. I will present, talking about trafficking in persons, some of the results of our research. Every 2 years we publish the global report on trafficking in persons. We collect information from all countries, about 140 countries around the world. Of course, I will present some charts concerning Europe, and as you can see, those are the, let's say, the trafficking flows, not the smuggling flows, the trafficking flows ending up into Western and Southern Europe, which for us is basically the European Union plus Switzerland, Norway, and so forth. So as you can see, I was saying before, not all trafficking victims are migrants. As a matter of fact, we see an increasing number of national victims. So Italians trafficked and exploited in Italy, Germans exploited in Germany, and so forth. This has always been a very important phenomenon, but recently is increasing. So actually, 35% of the victims detected in Western and Southern Europe are actually nationals of the country where they were exploited, where they were found exploited. But if we look outside Europe, the most relevant flows are those from West Africa and East Africa, and of course, North Africa. So many of these victims, as said before, not all, but many of these victims end up in a situation, in those situations that I was mentioning before. So in a situation of debt bondage as a result of a smuggling, or in the context of a smuggling process, or because of course they have these, they may not be in that bondage, but they may be vulnerable because they are irregular. Migrants. And as a fear, of course, they will not report their status of being exploited. And then, of course, we have other flows from Asia that are also very relevant, and they are more or less in the same situation. We know, for instance, if we look at the most recent trends, that victims, that migrants who are smuggled across the central Mediterranean routes, one of the main citizenship is Bangladesh. So the fact that South Asians, as you can see in the map, accounts for about 5%. Some of these are also, let's say, smuggled across the central Mediterranean route, not all, of course. What's the trend? If we look at the trends, and this is very important, we have been collecting this data, of course, since many years. We have a database that goes back to with the victims of trafficking that have been detected since the year 2003. So the most recent data, the one that I'm presenting, of course, I refer to the 2018. And you can see that for many years, the most relevant flows of victims of trafficking have been into Western Europe, have been victims from Southeastern Europe. So basically from the Balkans, from Romania, Bulgaria, Western Balkans. So again, most of the victims in Europe are Europeans. But this has been reducing, as you can see, drastically reducing over the last few years. From 33% or from 47% in 2014 to 17% in 2018. That is the most recent, the most up-to-date information that we have. Whereas if we look at the trafficking flows, again, not smuggling flows, trafficking flows from sub-Saharan Africa, the share of victims detected in Europe are more or less constant. And as mentioned before, nowadays this is the most relevant trafficking flows into Europe beside the domestic trafficking. Then of course we have the victims from East Asia and from other regions. But it seems that the trafficking flows are quite persistent. Of course, we lack of the most recent information, 2019-2020, but somehow this goes in that direction, that restrictive measures that have been put in place, let's say, after 2015, 2016, are not reflected in the trafficking numbers. So we may see a reduction maybe of the migration flows, perhaps, but in terms of victims, victims of trafficking, we are always there. And I also would like to mention that it seems that whereas in the past we had more victims from Nigeria, for instance, now the nationalities of the trafficking victims, it's more diverse. So we see victims that are, of course, from Nigeria, but we see a bit less than in the past, but we see victims from Côte d'Ivoire, from Cameroon, from Guinea, for instance, and of course from other parts of Africa, East Africa in particular. And we see more victims also from North Africa. What about the future? Of course, as I said, we don't have the most recent information, 2019, 2020, in terms of trafficking data, but I would like to present something that is not related to...
Please go to the conclusion, if you can.
Yes.
Thanks.
Very quickly, we need to see the impact of the COVID resulting, the COVID recession on trafficking persons. We see, well, this chart shows that trafficking flows are strictly connected to socioeconomic dynamics. When unemployment in Bulgaria goes up, the share of Bulgarian victims in the Netherlands increase. And this has been happening for the last 20 years a couple of times. So we need to see how the lockdown and the COVID-19 recession resulting from the COVID-19 crisis will have an impact, because as the World Bank has predicted, this economic crisis will have a strong impact on sub-Saharan Africa, also in terms of disequalities. And I pass the floor to you.
Thanks a lot, Fabrizio. We will come back to this relation between unemployment and human trafficking. It's extremely interesting because the data you're bringing are strong enough to say that this is showing a lot of consequences. The next speaker is now moving toward what we call policies, not politics, but policies. And it's Laura Ferrara. Laura Ferrara is a member of the Libe Committee of the European Parliament. She's also Italian, and I'm extremely grateful to Laura for joining to this webinar. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Good afternoon to everybody. Good afternoon to all the speakers, to all the participants. And thank you very much indeed for the invitation to all the organizers of this event. So the focus of my speech coincides a lot with the main points and the arguments and the results of the research of Professor Razziani and the speech of the President speakers. So organized crime is an increasingly dynamic and complex phenomenon, especially with regard to the exploitation of human mobility as a new criminal market. And I believe it is very relevant to analyze the dynamism of migratory flows and the role played by organized criminal networks in unblocking and enabling human mobility, especially as the consequences of these criminal interferences affect the lives and the human rights of migrants and a displaced population. So first of all, I would like to talk about how increased external border controls provide opportunities for criminal networks to facilitate irregular migration to Europe. We always heard in the European policies and in the speech of the European Commission or in the European Parliament that the main objective is the fight against organized crime, the fight against smugglers and traffickers. But the truth is that in a context where the legal entry channels for migration flows are strongly reduced, and in the awareness of the fact that migration constitutes a phenomenon that always existed and will be always present, as also the President von der Leyen said during a plenary session some months ago, the result of increased border controls is that on one hand, there is no management of migratory flows because asylum seekers will always try to explore new ways to do the final step to reach Europe. And on the other hand, organized crime will see more and more opportunities because many desperate asylum seekers will ask their help, even paying or by submitting to labor and sexual abuses to evade external border controls and find new ways, even if more dangerous. So migrants are finally exposed to greater dangers because criminal networks quickly adopt more risky strategies, shaping the resurgence of pathways such as the deadly route through the Canary Islands, now witnessing an unprecedented number of arrivals. So the paradox is that increased external border controls risk to enhance the power of organized crime in a context where there are no legal and safe ways and safe alternatives for asylum seekers to reach Europe and to exercise their right to ask the international protection. Secondly, I would like to refer to the fundamental challenges of tackling corruption and money laundering as crucial obstacle to the fight against transnational organized crime related to migration. The abuse of entrusted power for a private gain, along with the transformation of dirty money into legitimate funds, are crimes that make other crimes possible. Corruption is endemic in many origin and transit countries, threatening political and economic stability, undermining the rule of law, and ultimately enabling criminal organizations to emerge and to flourish. If border protection, immigration control, and law enforcement efforts are not effective in disrupting the smuggling and the trafficking business model, it is also because their impact has been neutralized by corruption. We cannot forget that migrant smuggling is only successful if public authorities are corrupt, and the purchase of the complicity through bribes is in turn possible by the large revenues generated by these criminal offenses. So in addition, transnational organized crime requires money launderers to create and to sustain the architecture by which illicit activities can be veiled. As they operate in the shadow of the global economy, traffickers are progressively diversifying and interconnecting their activities. Thus, profits from migrant smuggling are reinvested around the world in other crimes such as drug trafficking, human trafficking, fake medicines, or the financing of terrorism, multiplying their dirty profits exponentially. In this sense, strengthening anti-money laundering laws could make the smuggling of migrants a less profitable crime, thus discouraging organized criminal groups from engaging in it. And with this in mind, the EU's sixth anti-money laundering directive, to be transposed by December 2020, provides for an harmonized definition of money laundering based on an expanded list of 22 offenses, including terrorism financing, human trafficking, and migrant smuggling. It is also extends criminal liability to businesses and establishes toll punishments. But nevertheless, there is still a lot of work to do. Therefore, it is now time to ask whether the new pact on asylum and migration offers a path towards a sustainable and effective solution. It is clear that in order to counter transnational crime related to migration, the adoption of security measures can only be effective and sustainable if accompanied by other solutions. Strengthening external border controls fail if the drivers and dynamics of migration are not addressed. The underlying social, economic, and political pressures that fuel the crime cannot be ignored. Unemployment, war, persecution are three of the many reasons people decide to leave their home country. Pull factors include demand for cheap and documented labor in countries of destination and so on. So, examining these issues, it is first of all essential to curb migrants' demand for smuggling mafias by opening up new legal entry channels, as the most of the speakers said, and strengthening existing ones for refugees and asylum seekers. Legal alternatives to irregular arrivals are also tools to disrupt the business model of smugglers and traffickers. In this sense, resettlement to the EU is a tried and tested way to provide protection to the most vulnerable refugees, and the new pact has the goal to increase these programs. In regards to labor mobility, the new pact proposes to complete the unfinished work of reforming the EU Blue Card Directive as an important talent scheme. Moreover, the Commission has the intention to present a new EU action plan against migrant smuggling for 2021-2025, but I'm sure that Dr. Cioffi will speak about it better than me. So, secondly, criminal organizations make huge profits from secondary movements in the EU, mostly aimed at crossing the Western Balkans and the English Channel. To this end, the new regulation on asylum and migration management, which replaces the Dublin III, introduces new criteria for establishing a connection with a member state, such as a possession of a diploma or other qualification, and thus determining responsibility for examining application for international protection accordingly. In addition, it includes a broader definition of family members in order to preserve family reunification, but very unfortunately, the principle of first country of arrival remains the default option. And this is totally counterproductive for stopping any secondary movement. So leaving aside the drastic human rights and socio-economic impacts of quasi-maintaining a doubling for the first country of entry, the obsessive focus of the new pact on externalizing border control means increasing challenges to deter the action of criminal organizations. Among the most problematic issues, there is a proposal to introduce a screening procedure at the external borders to channel all third country nationals into the right procedure. It has to quickly return underserving, abusing migrants and liberate normal asylum procedures for those in need of protection. After the screening, those who are not likely to be beneficiaries of international protection would be subject to a new border procedure for a maximum duration of 12 weeks, detention being allowed during that time. So pending the results of the screening and the decision of the border procedure, individuals are presumed not to have legally entered into a member state's territory. So consequently, the questionable legality of the location outside the territory of the EU, along with the probability of open, prolonged and mass detention of migrants and asylum seekers, pose great concerns for human rights. Besides, the complexity of the procedures may be profited by criminal organizations, either by increasing the demand for their services or the supply for their exploitation purposes. So to conclude, European migration policies are not sufficient to combat the criminal networks that benefit billions from the absence of legal and safe migration pathways to Europe. Moreover, the primacy of a defensive security approach over collective responsibility is adding layers of vulnerability to migrants who are exploited by traffickers and criminals to the detriment of human rights. This is why the United Nations Global Compact for Migration, although not binding, is an opportunity, is a very important opportunity that the EU, as a global player in migration, should seize to establish a sustainable and effective strategy. The European Parliament has long called for the establishment of an EU-wide humanitarian visa, a precondition for the establishment of humanitarian corridor to the EU. And we are hopeful that the revision of the Schengen border code next year will overcome the deadlock in the negotiation, so that the EU complies with the objective 5 of the Global Compact of creating availability and flexibility of pathways for regular migration. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thanks, Laura, for this. I think it's very relevant what you said. The security measures should be accompanied by other solutions. And I think this is really interesting because the perception we do have is today that the European policies against human smuggling or illegal migration are closing, opening the borders, doubling yes, doubling no. But I've read the material of the migration. There is a vision there. I think I'm sure Giovanni Cioffi will speak about, but I don't think European citizens perceive that European Union has a vision about migration problems, and the problem is about implementing it, because we know or are fully aware that the European member states have some problems about. Well, the last speaker is Giovanni Cioffi. I'm grateful for Giovanni coming to this webinar. Giovanni is a European Commission policy officer at DG Immigration and Home Affairs dealing with migration issues. Giovanni, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Professor Savona, first of all, for inviting me to this webinar. I will share a presentation, if I manage. Okay, it should be there. Okay, I hope it's visible to everybody. Well, I will try to speak about what the Commission and the EU has done to counter migration smuggling, and in particular what has been done to support third countries on migration to counter migration smuggling. I will start by something that has already been mentioned, the Action Plan 2015-2020, which was part of the European Agenda on Migration published in 2015, the moment of the big migratory crisis. And the action plan was constructed around 4 pillars: enhancing the political and judicial response, improving gathering and sharing of information, enhancing prevention of smuggling assistance to vulnerable migrants, and stronger cooperation with third countries. So it's an intersection of measures on the internal and on the external side. Not only cooperation with third countries should be seen as the external side, but also increasing the information we receive on smuggling of migrants from third countries, preventing smuggling on vulnerable smuggling of vulnerable migrants from third countries, and in particular. The actions in third countries has been focused around two things: judicial and law enforcement cooperation with third countries, and a first way of seeing it is capacity building. Capacity building, has been for many years a pillar of EU cooperation with third countries on law enforcement, and in particular also in recent years we have invested a lot, especially through the EU Trust Fund for Africa, on improving the capacities of law enforcement agencies, of judicial authorities to counter migrant smuggling, but also, for example, to exchange information between third countries, exchange information with the EU actors. But maybe something which has been quite new is also the possibility for operational cooperation with third countries. Of course, cooperating with third countries is not an easy task, and I think this has also been mentioned by a previous speaker. Cooperating on smuggling is even more difficult, because smuggling very often in some third countries is simply seen as a sort of provision of services for a quite natural phenomenon like migration. But maybe this hides a bit the reality that in the last years criminal organizations have been growing thanks to the profits made out of migrant smuggling. So speaking about operational cooperation, one of the examples that has emerged in the last years is the Joint Investigation Team in Niger. Joint Investigation Team in Niger is a project that has been funded under the EU Trust Fund for Africa, allowing for a strict cooperation and also on the ground between French law enforcement, Spanish law enforcement, and the Nigerian police. This cooperation has started from capacity building, from a reform of the legislation on smuggling in Niger, and then it has developed also in a more concrete assistance on operations to dismantle smuggling organizations in Niger, and also to improve the way the crime is prosecuted in Niger. This has been a bit a model for a more developed concept that came after. Started arriving in 2019. After that, the Justice and Home Affairs Council in December 2019 adopted a common set of operational measures against smuggling, and this concept of common operational partnerships is a bit an evolution of these joint investigation teams. It's a flexible way of cooperating with third countries that can involve many member states, and let's say it can be adapted a bit to the context. Also at the light of fact that the context in Niger is quite specific, and the same measures and the same way of approaching the issue in Niger could not be entirely replicated in other third countries. So let's say that the Common Operational Partnership provides us a sort of toolkit that can be put at disposal of third countries and can be implemented by, in cooperation with member states. And the aim is I would say that the main aim is to enhance mutual trust and cooperation with third countries, but also to give them a sense of ownership on fighting migrant smuggling. This is a bit what has been done, as I said, in Niger. In Niger, it's the Nigerian police that carries out the operations. It's the Nigerian judiciary that carries out investigation and prosecution of the crimes, with the assistance of the European law enforcement. Projects project common operational partnerships are already ongoing on various migratory routes. We have a project on the so-called Silk Road, involving countries that go from Pakistan till the Western Balkans, with the cooperation of member states, of 4 member states, in particular from Eastern countries. We have a project that has recently started on the Central Mediterranean route, which is, with a quite large consortium composed of member states and countries from different parts of Africa, leading to the Central Mediterranean route. And we have another project that has recently started with Senegal. There are also others in the pipeline, since this is an instrument that the Commission very much believes in. But action in third countries, it's not simply and only cooperation on law enforcement. It's also about prevention, carrying out information campaign and awareness raising campaigns in third countries. Well, this is something in which, again, the Commission has invested a lot. We have had, and we still have ongoing 15 campaigns along the main migratory routes. What these campaigns try to do also at community level is, telling the real story about the risks of migrant smuggling and irregular migration, and based also on researches that tell us that most of the migrants that arrive in Europe have used at a certain stage of their travel smuggling services, and most of them had underestimated the risks that they were running along the route. And at the same time, it tries to present also legal opportunities, legal channels that currently exist. Then, another issue is what, again, has been already been said, that maybe these legal channels are currently insufficient. But these campaigns try to present what are the opportunities for either legally migrating towards Europe, either use opportunities that maybe EU projects create on the ground, and in a certain sense counter the disinformation narratives of the smugglers. So this is a bit what has been done, what is being done, but maybe to conclude just a bit, that I will try to tell you what about the future. In the new pact on asylum and migration, there is a full chapter dedicated to smuggling, and in particular, there is mention that the Commission will adopt a new EU action plan against smuggling for the period 2021-2025. This should be done in the first semester of 2021, and in particular, and this action plan will dedicate a particular attention to third countries. In particular, the main objective will be to create counter-smuggling partnerships as part of the broader partnerships on migration that the Commission and the EU member states will try to promote with third countries. I think that many of the activities will be in continuity with the action plan, with the previous action plan, because I think despite maybe some underachievements of the plan, I mean, there have been also many achievements that contributed to stem the flows of irregular migration towards the EU, and we will try to build on these achievements, build on the common operational partnerships, propose additional information campaigns along the migratory routes, but also take into account maybe new phenomena that have been emerging in the last years, like for example the digital smuggling, the use of social media by smugglers. And for example, many of the information campaigns that we are funding have also an internet-based and social media component. And maybe just to give a bit an example, we have already had an anticipation of what dialogue with third countries will look like. In July, there has been a ministerial conference that promoted by Italy together with the Commission that has involved 5 member states, Italy, Spain, France, Germany, and Malta, engaging with 5 African countries, mostly from North Africa, Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, and Mauritania, where some political commitments have been taken on tackling migrant smuggling. Now, I mean, from the Commission side, and also with the ministries of interior of these member states, we are working on the operationalization of these political commitments.
Please conclude.
This is not an easy task, passing from the political dimension to the operational dimension. So that was a bit to give a hint of what the future might reserve us.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Cioffi. Thanks a lot for this input. Now, for those people who want to make a question, you have a Q&A or domanda risposte. It depends if you're speaking Italian or English. Just send and we will try to answer. There is one question about Maisa, a person anonymous. It's very happy you are here because, and I really share this view because we Europeans are discussing about European migration between us. We discuss about closing, opening the border, policies, other things. The person who is putting the question says, could you please tell us what is the point of view of Egyptians about the immigration to Europe? We will be very happy to know in a very short time, let me say, Maisa, what happens in Egypt? How is the debate about flying or going to Europe on illegal?
Thank you. Thank you for the comment. And I mean, the perception in Egypt, of course, by the majority is that there are strict policies in Europe that not particularly Egyptian, but Arab and particularly Muslim are perceived in a negative light, that there is fear of the migrants, that there are too much over control, that we're not really welcomed. And it's not only about irregular migrants, but even the fact that even myself, if I would like to travel to Europe, it's not easy. Going through the process of visa and acquiring visa. So people always talk about that, but at the same time, I mean, in Egypt as in Europe, you will find also people with different perspectives. So there are the right wing, and there is also right wing perspective in Egypt. So some would actually think that Europe restricting policies is right, because they believe that they have to fear the terrorist possibility and so on and so forth. So it really depends. But the majority, of course, are not happy with the restriction and the fact that we are seen as potential danger, even regular travelers.
a lot, Maïsa. I would like to do a small exercise between the speakers, if there are no other questions, but there is another question which is speaking about the legal possibility for migrating. But I will put this question in the between of my question to each of the speakers, starting from Mr. Cioffi. This webinar is a mix of researchers, we are presenting research results, also if it's not definitive, and policymakers, Parliament, Libe Committee, and the Commission. Mixing up the research and data with policies really is the focus of what Transcrime does as a research center. We try to be successful in informing policymakers on what are the costs and the benefits of policies against crime, also on the side of what is the cost of criminals, in order to increase the cost of criminals. But my question to you, Mr. Cioffi, starting from you and going to the two policymakers, you and Laura, is the following. Which kind of data you need for your policies? This is really extremely interesting because my question to the researchers will be exactly the reverse. How you can think to contribute to policies? The discussion is very open about the European action plan. I think action plan is very relevant because there is a vision there, also if it's not implemented. But once again, my question to the researchers, starting from Fabrizio Sarica, going back to Alberto, will be what you expect from the policies doing? Do we want to discuss immediately the issue of the legal migration, illegal, as we have done for drugs, or we think this will come later on in the public debate in Europe? Starting from Mr. Cioffi. Mr. Cioffi, it's a very short question, it's a very short answer we expect from you. Which kind of data you expect from us doing research?
Thanks a lot for the interesting question. Well, I must say we are very much in touch, at least from Commission side, with academics. We look into academic research. We have also our own center, which is quite close to Milan, actually, the Knowledge Center on Migration and Demography in Ispra that works on researches. So we value a lot data. We value a lot data for preparing also our policy documents. Then I think that another issue is that whether political decisions that are subsequent to proposals or also policy documents are data driven. I mean, I think that it's quite a matter of fact the need of opening new legal channels, but I think that also government takes into account more political sensitivities inside member states when it's about opening legal channel to migration. So one thing is using data to feed our policy documents. Another issue is whether political decisions will be based on this data.
No, it's another story.
I must say we don't need to be. I don't think we can be naive on this issue, and we are not naive. Also from the Commission side, I think that we take these sensitivities into account also in our proposals. Maybe something more could have been done in the Pact on Asylum Migration on opening legal channels. But first, we need to consider whether this is always a competence of at EU level, and second, which possibilities more extensive proposals on opening legal channels would have had to pass with member states.
Yeah, well, my idea is that we should on some time measure the impact of all these policies, the cost in terms of right and economic cost, but I don't think none is doing this kind of analysis, but sooner or later somebody will pay the bill, and at the moment in terms of human rights, migrants are paying the bill. Laura, in 1 minute only, sorry to be short, do you have an idea of what you need for research from in terms of data?
It's not easy to answer in just 1 minute, but I'll do my best. And I think that it's important to have the costs of non-Europe not only in terms of economic costs, but also in terms of violations of human rights and fundamental rights.
Yeah.
So it should be a broader research, a huge research. But sadly, if I have to be frank, what can deadlock the situation are numbers, are economic costs. So maybe what can push member states to have the will to put in place legal ways to reach Europe for asylum seekers can be the demonstration of economic costs of non-Europe in search and rescue operation, in the lack of legal ways to exercise the right of asylum, and yes, and also all the costs related to human resources, the infrastructures that all the member states need to verify if all the irregular migrants that arrive are really potential asylum seekers or other kind of migrants. As we said, as we saw in the new pact, it has been introduced the screening procedure, the border procedure, the mandatory border procedure, just to have a filter to evaluate the chance of the possibilities to get the international protection before going ahead with the examination of the application and the eventual relocation among the member states of asylum seekers. So all of these steps, all of these procedures have a cost, an economic cost in terms of human resources, in terms of infrastructures, in terms of the diplomatic relation with the third countries, in terms of time, in terms of management of civil situation, because there are many citizens, European citizens, that start to ask what we will do with all of these irregular migrants if we will not able to return them in their country of origin. And we perfectly know that is not easy, is definitely not easy to manage this kind of situation where there are also right-wing movements, right-wing forces that enhance these difficulties in this situation. So yes, maybe this can help to... Yeah.
Thanks, Laura. It's the turn of Fabrizio, but I have a question for him, for the people, but for him. Could you, Fabrizio, speak about the influence of the media on the perception and aspiration of potential migrants? How does the media coverage affect traffickers' business? And what effect does it have on potential migrants, the media coverage on the local place? Could you answer in 1 minute, Fabrizio?
Yes, actually it's very difficult to answer. I personally have interviewed Afghan refugees who told me that the smuggler in the countries of origin has sold them Hollywood. So they imagine their lives in Europe something different. So there is the image of, but on the other hand, we know from our research that many sub-Saharan Africans are totally aware of let's say, greatly aware of what the situation in destination countries or possible risk, but they don't give much values to the risks. In other cases, we are talking about people that are fleeing. So they are more concerned on what they are leaving on their back. and not what to, let's say, they don't even consider what they could, the risk that they are facing in front, because they know what they are fleeing from. So this is the most important thing. So it may have an impact. We don't know this, but I assume that it will really depend on the profile of migrants or refugees we are interviewing or we are studying. So difficult to say.
Thanks, Fabrizio. Maisa, do you have a thought of 30 seconds about what you expect from policymakers? Just a very short thought. In your country, what do you expect from your policymakers?
In my country? A policymaker in my country?
Yeah, what do you expect from them? On this field, of course.
Okay. There is talk right now that there might be, which is the first time, discussion of a local asylum legislation, which, if this will really materialize, I think this is a very positive endeavor, because as I said, in Egypt there is no local asylum legislation at all, and integration is not discussed. So as I said, they are dealing with a very old memorandum of understanding signed in 1954. So to talk about possibility of having, of course we are worried because we don't know what kind of local asylum procedure it will look like, but we're hoping that this is, at least the discussion will start, and this is something we're looking for, to have a legal framework concerning refugees in Egypt. With regard to migrants, I just want, migrants is very different, and for Egyptian migrants, I can talk from the interviews that we did with Egyptian migrants, particularly those who were living in the Gulf. All of them, they were planning to come back. None of them took their families. So it was mainly a male phenomena. And this perception still continues. So, I mean, their thinking of migration is only a temporary thing. So I don't know, I mean, the worry of that migrants would go long-term and stay and long-term settlement, it doesn't apply to all migrants. Maybe in the case of refugees, but with the case of migrants from certain countries, it could be a short time. So this is something that I think policymakers in Europe should be aware of. That their intention is to come back.
Thanks, Maisa, for these. Luigi, you are a qualitative researcher. In less than 30 seconds, could you say one sentence about what you expect from those politicians which are dealing with migration? You look to the effect of these. So you are not dealing with policies, but this is the case where you can send a message to policymakers.
Yeah, what I do expect is very little. What I would like to see, on the other hand, is a strengthening and, well, it's the opening of new channels of legal mobility. This is what I would like to see. As a matter of fact, the emphasis, despite this organic talk about having an organic approach to deal with irregular migration, the emphasis has been on the tightening of border control and the progressive externalization of asylum responsibilities. These measures are so much entrenched within policy and political discourse that Dublin, for example, the reform of Dublin has been knocked off the top priorities in the ongoing reforms of the common European asylum system. I would like to see more emphasis on Dublin, for example, rather than on externalization of border control.
Thanks, Luigi. The last question is for Alberto. One question is about some results about anti-money laundering case studies published by Financial Action Task Force show that regular immigrants can be exploited, and that in this case, the danger can never be greater for the economic dynamic financial system, which means on the end of the story, not only in terms of exploitation is done by illegal, but also legal. Alberto, could you make a comment or answer to this question?
Sure. As first, we didn't focus on this specific aspect, and I'm not an expert on this. Having said this, the fact that the migrant is actually legally in the country, I don't see why it should make things even worse in terms of exploitation. It might be that the frequency of involvement in the exploitation mechanism is higher, but at least being legally in the country, she might rely on better supports and better legal institution to solve his problems. So in very brief, I would say that I don't see really the risk of legalizing migrants because of the risk of a greater propensity to get exploited. But
thanks, Alberto. We are 5 minutes later and we need to conclude. Really, you have done the best comments. I don't think I should make any conclusion, because here there is no conclusion at all, which means for sure in reading the documents of the European Commission, there is a clear improvement about the vision about migrants. If this vision corresponds to the action or policy, it's very difficult. We need to think that Europe is not really a federation, but it's a sum of many countries and member states with different political logic. Sooner or later, I think somebody should present the bill of these non-actions or actions, because the migrants' pressure is increasing to European, and many other phenomena such as the low birth rate, others will need sooner or later this population. Better to think now than in 10 years' time. But I'm really grateful to Alberto for presenting the research, to Luigi for intervention, to Fabrizio and Maisa for their research coming from different perspectives, and once again to Laura and Mr. Cioffi for intervening, giving and opening the window about what the European Union is doing. I'm very happy that the participants were 230 in the beginning, registered 160 came in contacting. Now there are exactly 100, which is the threshold, which is better we conclude, because otherwise they will be diminishing. Thanks a lot to everybody, and thanks to Carla Castorina for having managed all these things. See you sometime in the next few months for different reasons. For the time being, have a good weekend for you. Bye-bye.